Karoline Leavitt walked into a small-town courtroom for a routine zoning issue and walked out, having ignited a statewide movement for justice. If you believe that one voice can make a difference, that silence can be louder than outrage, and that true leadership means standing tall when it's hardest, this story is for you. The soft hum of early autumn wind rustled the trees outside Karoline Leavitt's Washington, D.C. townhouse as the first light of day filtered through her home office windows. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Neatly stacked press briefings, folders labeled by policy, and a color-coded planner open beside a half-finished legal pad. Karoline, 27, the youngest press secretary in White House history, moved with practiced calm, reviewing two sets of documents, one for the day's press briefing on the Yellowstone naming decree, and the other, less urgent but more personal, a zoning violation hearing in Silvergate, Colorado. The violation had to do with her family's old farmhouse on the edge of town, recently used as a volunteer center during the campaign, now facing closure for supposedly breaching municipal use restrictions. She'd tried to resolve it remotely but finally decided to handle it in person. Despite the tension ahead, the morning felt almost serene. She brewed her usual coffee, strong, dark roast, and tied her hair back into a simple bun, her natural blonde strands tucked behind her ears. There was no press pool to face, no podium, just a courtroom in a town where she once knocked on doors and passed out flyers. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and dark jeans, business casual with a statement, she gave one last glance in the mirror. It was strange, stepping out of the high-stakes arena of D.C. politics to face a local judge over land permits. But Karoline knew better than anyone that perception mattered, no matter the scale. Just as she zipped her leather laptop bag and reached for her car keys, her phone buzzed. It was David Klein, Senior Communications Director at the White House. "Karoline, we've got a problem." His voice clipped and urgent. "The press is in full meltdown over the Yellowstone rename order. You're going to need to review the response by 10:30 latest. We need your fingerprints on it." Karoline's jaw tightened. "I'm flying out to Colorado in an hour, court appearance. Then I'll find a quiet place and draft it." David sighed. "This could explode if we don't frame it right. You're the only one who knows how to spin it legally and politically." She nodded, already mentally rearranging her schedule. She had time, barely. With her phone tucked to her ear and the other hand on her car's ignition, Karoline backed out of the garage in her BMW, a reward she'd bought herself after Trump's surprise second-term win. As she pulled onto the highway, the Capitol slowly fading behind her, she thought, just a zoning hearing, just a statement draft, nothing she couldn't juggle. But deep down, a quiet voice warned her, the day ahead wasn't going to be that simple. Not when you carried both a government title and a last name tied to a town that remembered you differently. Silvergate wasn't just a court date. It was a reckoning. Karoline's boots clicked softly against the weathered stone platform as she stepped off the afternoon train into Silvergate, Colorado, a town cradled between gold-streaked hills and the whisper of pine forests. The air here was different, cleaner, slower, more suspicious. She paused, taking in the view of Main Street, a quaint row of brick storefronts, faded political banners left from the last midterm elections, and the looming silhouette of the Silvergate County Courthouse, its colonial spire standing like a finger pointed at heaven. It had been years since she'd set foot here. Though born in New Hampshire, Karoline had spent summers volunteering in Silvergate during her college years, and her family's campaign property on the outskirts of T. Rowe Park, a restored 1,890s farmhouse, had made waves during the 2020 election. But now that same farmhouse was under scrutiny, labeled by the city as a zoning violation for unauthorized civic activity. She knew the hearing was supposed to be minor, just procedural, but something about Silvergate always felt loaded, political, personal. Her ride from the station, a local shuttle van driven by a man who looked at her twice when she said her name, dropped her at the Iron Lantern Inn, a humble 3-story lodge with wooden beams, iron lantern sconces, and a polite but distant receptionist who handed her the room key without much eye contact. Karoline could feel the air shift when people recognized her, not as a neighbor, but as that White House woman, Trump's mouthpiece, the one who'd defended the Yellowstone order on national television just last week. The lobby had a copy of the Silvergate Beacon folded on a coffee table. The front page headline read, "Locals Fight Back Against Yellowstone Rebrand," page 4. She didn't need to open it, she already knew the angle. Upstairs, her room was tidy and rustic, quilted bedspread, ceramic lamp shaped like a moose, a view of the courthouse clock tower across the street. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop. Before she even connected to the inn's Wi-Fi, 3 new emails from David Klein lit up the screen. Media angle shifting fast. Need confirmation of language by morning. Governor weighing in. Might get messy. Karoline rubbed her temples. She had 18 hours to write a bulletproof media response about a national park being renamed after a sitting president, and a local zoning case to win before a judge who probably hated everything she represented. Her fingers flew across the keys as she toggled between press briefings, court documents, and notes she'd collected from conversations with land use attorneys. She wasn't a lawyer by trade, but working alongside campaign counsel for years had taught her how to read between the lines of legalese. Outside, the courthouse lights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the steps. The courtroom inside waited for her. So did Judge Ronald Beckett, whose reputation for strictness had only hardened since his appointment decades ago. She'd done her research. He was respected, feared, and firmly opposed to politicizing local institutions. Karoline knew she'd be walking into that courtroom tomorrow morning with a target on her back. Not because of who she was in person, but because of who she represented. Trump, D.C., the machine. As she packed up for the night and headed back toward the inn, she made a mental checklist. Review zoning precedent, revise statement language, call David by 7 a.m., and most importantly, don't let tomorrow rattle you. What she didn't know was that Silvergate was already buzzing with anticipation, and the courthouse wasn't just preparing for a zoning dispute, it was bracing for a storm. The next morning began with the crisp scent of pine drifting through the open window of Karoline's inn room, and the muffled chime of Silvergate's courthouse bell striking 7 a.m. She had already been up for an hour, seated cross-legged on the bed, laptop balanced on her knees, coffee cooling beside her untouched. The draft for the Yellowstone decree response was halfway done, but the wording wasn't sitting right. Every sentence had to walk a tightrope, defend the administration's decision without inflaming environmentalists, avoid legal missteps, and preempt the inevitable media backlash. David Klein's text at 6:13 a.m. had made things worse. CNN pushing ego-branding narrative. Can you refocus on heritage language? Karoline's jaw clenched. She was used to high-stakes messaging, but not from a Colorado inn with spotty Wi-Fi and a courtroom deadline breathing down her neck. By 8 a.m. she had showered, dressed in a structured navy blazer and black slacks, and packed her legal materials into a sleek leather tote. She checked her phone one last time. Still need final edits, can't wait past 10:30. She sighed, grabbed her laptop and coffee thermos and headed out. Instead of going straight to the courthouse, she crossed the square to Luna's Cafe, the only place open early, with strong enough Wi-Fi to upload files securely. The cafe buzzed with quiet morning energy. Students cramming for finals, 2 contractors arguing over zoning permits, and a reporter she vaguely recognized from last year's Denver rally. Karoline tuned it all out. She connected to her hotspot just to be safe and dove into edits. Line by line, she reconstructed the message, adding references to historical naming precedents, Native American consultations, and tourism strategy, crafting each paragraph with surgical precision. She'd just hit Save Draft when she glanced at her watch. 9:30 a.m. Her hearing had started at 9:30. Her stomach dropped. She scrambled to shut her laptop, shove everything into her tote, and rush out the door, apologizing to the startled barista she nearly collided with. The courthouse was a 5-minute walk, 10 if traffic was heavy and parking a nightmare, and it was. By the time she found a legal space and hustled across the square, it was 9:47. Her heels echoed against the marble courthouse steps as she hurried inside, breath steady but nerves twitching. She knew being late wasn't ideal, but it wasn't rare either. Local hearings were notoriously flexible. What she didn't know was that Judge Ronald Beckett had already noticed her absence. Worse, he'd already made assumptions about it. As Karoline took a deep breath outside courtroom B, adjusting her blazer and smoothing her hair, she told herself it would be fine. She was composed, prepared, and ready to explain the delay. But the truth was, in Judge Beckett's courtroom, explanation wasn't always welcomed, especially not from someone who brought Washington with her like a shadow. Karoline stepped into courtroom B with the quiet urgency of someone who knew she was late but had no intention of appearing flustered. The room, paneled in dark walnut and bathed in morning light filtering through tall windows, was already in session. Rows of townspeople filled the benches, contractors, small business owners, retirees, all waiting for their docket numbers to be called. But as the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind her, every eye turned toward the woman in the tailored blazer with the DC polish. Seated high above them all was Judge Ronald Beckett, 68 years old, sharp-nosed with slicked-back gray hair and thin-framed glasses that magnified his already severe gaze. The second he saw Karoline, he paused mid-sentence, the case before him hanging in the air like an interrupted breath. "Miss Leavitt," he said, coldly enunciating each syllable of her name as he set the folder in his hand aside. "You were scheduled at 9:30. It is now 9:48. His voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. Karoline took a calming breath and approached the podium with her usual poise. She opened her mouth to speak, but Beckett raised a hand silencing her. "You may think that in Washington people can stroll into important matters whenever it suits them, but in Silvergate, we start on time." She blinked, stunned by the immediate hostility. "Your Honor, I understand and apologize. I was tending to—" "No excuses," he snapped. "This isn't a press conference where you control the room." A low murmur passed through the gallery. "You are not special here, Ms. Leavitt. You are a respondent in a zoning violation case, nothing more." Karoline felt the weight of the moment shift. She looked around and saw faces, curious, judgmental, some uncomfortable. But what struck her most was the indifference on the judge's face. He hadn't asked what delayed her. He didn't care. And she quickly realized, this wasn't about tardiness. This was about who she was. Beckett continued, "Given your lack of punctuality and apparent disregard for this court's time, I'm issuing a $600 fine for contempt. Perhaps that will remind you that respect for process matters, even in places without a camera." The fine hung heavy in the air. Karoline, still standing at the podium, kept her posture straight, her face unreadable. She didn't argue, not yet. Instead, she noted the way the judge hadn't glanced at her paperwork once. He hadn't asked a single substantive question about the zoning case. His decision was emotional, reactive, and clearly biased. She glanced at the court clerk, Teresa Molina, who hesitated briefly as she typed the fine into the record, her brows slightly furrowed. Karoline also caught the shift in Deputy Lucas Cheng's stance by the judge's bench, hands clasped tighter behind his back, eyes narrowing slightly. But Beckett wasn't done. "Let this be a reminder, Miss Leavitt, that your title outside this room has no meaning inside of it, and that perhaps next time you might respect the difference between a courtroom and a campaign trail." A few in the gallery chuckled under their breath. Others looked down, suddenly very interested in their shoes. Karoline's heart beat faster, not from shame, but from a different, sharper awareness. This man was performing, and the audience he craved wasn't just in this courtroom, it was everyone who resented her for what she represented. She took another deep breath and said nothing. Not yet. Judge Beckett reached for the next case file, already moving on. But in doing so, he missed the moment Karoline opened her leather notebook and began taking notes on everything. The words he used, the inconsistency of treatment, the fact that two older male defendants had arrived after her and received no such reprimand. He didn't know it yet, but his need to humiliate her had just handed her every tool she needed. In the span of a few minutes, a routine zoning hearing had become a fault line, and beneath the polished wood of Silvergate County Courtroom B, something had started to shift. Karoline didn't flinch as Judge Beckett returned to his docket, flipping through the next file as if her fine, and the public dressing down that preceded it, were nothing more than courtroom routine. But beneath her composed exterior, something had shifted. She remained at the podium, still and silent, letting the judge believe she had accepted his ruling, but her mind was moving at full speed. She had faced public scrutiny before, at the White House, podium, during hostile interviews, under the brutal lights of press briefings, but this was different. It was personal, and it was systemic. As she scanned the courtroom with a calm, deliberate gaze, she began noticing patterns, subtle but telling. The two older businessmen who had arrived after her sat relaxed and unbothered in the gallery, neither having received more than a gentle nod from the judge. A young woman in scrubs who had walked in right before Karoline was given a quiet verbal warning and ushered to the back without public mention. Yet Karoline, young, female, politically visible, had been turned into a spectacle. She opened her leather notebook and started writing, not just a record of the fine but the exact wording the judge had used. "Your title has no meaning. This isn't Washington. Perhaps a fine will remind you." Every word was ammunition, evidence. She noted the timestamp on her phone, how she'd entered the courtroom at 9:48 a.m., and how the court schedule showed at least 3 pending cases still open when she walked in. This wasn't about disruption, it was about power. From the corner of her eye, she saw Teresa Molina, the clerk, glancing at her intermittently. There was hesitation in the way Teresa typed, as if unsure whether to fully commit to the fine she was recording. Deputy Lucas Cheng stood a few feet behind the judge's bench, arms crossed now, his expression unreadable but attentive. He had been working in this courtroom for over a decade. He'd seen hundreds of cases. Karoline could feel it. He recognized what was happening, even if he couldn't say so. Karoline's quiet rebellion wasn't a protest. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was calculated, restrained, the kind of defiance that leaves no openings for dismissal or mockery. She didn't storm out, didn't raise her voice, didn't correct the judge. She documented, she observed, and more importantly, she waited. There was a difference between being silenced and choosing to stay silent. Because Karoline knew something Judge Beckett didn't, the real power wasn't in the gavel, it was in the record, and she was building one. Every second she stood there, poised and quiet, the courtroom grew more aware that something wasn't sitting right. Whispers began to circulate. Teresa typed slower. Lucas shifted his stance. The tone in the room had changed, but Judge Beckett, lost in his own authority, hadn't noticed. Not yet. Karoline closed her notebook, calmly returned it to her tote, and lifted her chin. Not in defiance, but in readiness. Her silence had spoken. The next move would be hers. Just as Judge Beckett began to call the next case, his voice steady and dismissive, Karoline Leavitt gently stepped forward again, not with a raised voice or dramatic interruption, but with the precision of someone who knew the rules well enough to challenge them. "Your Honor," she began, her tone calm yet unmistakably firm, "before the next matter proceeds, I respectfully request to clarify something for the record." Her words halted the air mid-breath. The clerk, Teresa Molina, froze with her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Deputy Lucas Cheng subtly stepped forward, sensing that this moment was different. Even the gallery stilled, heads turning, murmurs evaporating into silence. Beckett looked up, clearly irritated. "Miss Leavitt, I've ruled on your matter. The court is moving on." But Karoline stood her ground. "Understood, Your Honor. I'm not seeking to alter your ruling. I'm simply clarifying context for the public record." Her voice carried no hostility, only control. And in that moment, the judge's veneer of dominance cracked just enough. Perhaps curiosity got the better of him. Perhaps it was the gravity in her tone. "Proceed," he said curtly, folding his hands in front of him. Karoline opened her leather notebook and held it up, not as a prop, but as a weapon of facts. "I am Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary under President Donald J. Trump. While I am not a practicing attorney, I have extensive experience drafting legal language for federal communications and working alongside top campaign legal advisors." She paused, letting that sink in. Her credentials weren't a threat, they were context. "This morning I was delayed by a time-sensitive request from the White House regarding the Yellowstone National Preserve executive order. I have email records from Senior Communications Director David Klein requesting my legal review by 10:30 a.m., which I completed en route to this courthouse." The silence deepened. Karoline continued, "I fully accept responsibility for arriving late. What I cannot accept is the disparate treatment I received compared to others in this courtroom today. I observed at least 2 defendants arrive later than I did, both male, both older, who received no public reprimand, let alone a contempt fine." Beckett's expression shifted. His authority, just moments ago weaponized so confidently, now wavered under the weight of her precision. "Miss Leavitt," she held up a hand, gently, respectfully. "What concerns me is not the fine. I will pay it. But I believe this moment exposes a deeper issue. If my status as a White House official did not protect me, then perhaps others without my platform have endured similar treatment without any recourse." She turned slightly, addressing not just the judge, but everyone. "By assuming the role of preacher, I have to recognize that I'm not in trust with your legal system, and I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent when I've seen it firsthand." The courtroom was spellbound. Even Jillian Romero, the young law student observing from the back, dropped her pen, her eyes wide. Teresa's hands trembled slightly as she resumed typing, determined to capture every word. Lucas Cheng stood still, lips pressed in a thin line, a flicker of respect in his gaze. Judge Beckett looked at Karoline, really looked, beyond the title, beyond the assumption. For a fleeting second, something like regret passed over his face. "Miss Leavitt, if I had known—" "My role shouldn't matter," Karoline replied, her voice unwavering. "What should matter is equal treatment under the law." The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we can discuss this in chambers." "No, Your Honor," Karoline said, her tone still respectful but resolute. "The courtroom is where this happened. This is where it should be addressed." What unfolded next wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction, a rebalancing of scales long tilted. Karoline concluded her statement by formally entering her notes into the record and affirming that she would not request dismissal of the fine, not because she agreed with it, but because she intended to use it as evidence, as a symbol, as a spark. By the time she stepped away from the podium, the room had changed. The judge no longer seemed untouchable, the observers no longer seemed passive, and Karoline, far from just a public relations officer, had just redefined what it meant to hold power with purpose. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't demand respect, she earned it, word by word. By the time Karoline exited the courthouse, the crisp mountain air of Silvergate felt different, charged. The courthouse plaza, once sleepy and indifferent, now buzzed with a quiet current. Jillian Romero, the law student who had been observing from the back row, stood near the steps, phone in hand, her fingers flying across the screen. Her tweet was already live. "Just watched the White House press secretary dismantle a judge's bias in real time. Silvergate will never be the same. Legal genius." Within minutes the post began gaining traction, first among legal blogs, then through conservative influencers, and finally onto trending lists across Colorado. Back inside the courthouse, Teresa Molina sat frozen at her desk. After 12 years of quiet compliance, she opened her bottom drawer and pulled out the worn leather notebook she had kept hidden for more than a decade. Page after page, she had documented oddities, harsh fines, disproportionately given to younger defendants, dismissive language aimed at women, overlooked tardiness from familiar faces. Today she realized she wasn't alone in seeing it. Karoline had named it aloud. Teresa clutched the notebook to her chest, the weight of its contents now pressing toward action. Meanwhile, Lucas Cheng, the bailiff, returned to his small security room off the main hallway and made a quiet call to a former colleague at the state's Judicial Oversight Office. "It finally happened," he said simply. "Someone said what we've all been thinking." For years, Lucas had watched Beckett operate with a rigid sense of hierarchy, where status and age often determined who was heard and who was dismissed. But until now, no one had stood their ground quite like Karoline. At a nearby cafe, Locals who had witnessed the exchange were already sharing their versions of the story. One man who had received a steep fine from Beckett last year muttered, "Took someone from Washington to finally show him he's not king." Another elderly woman who had never liked Karoline's politics whispered to her friend, "Didn't agree with her views, but she held her own today, with class." By early afternoon, the first news outlet picked up Jillian's viral post. A Denver-based online paper ran the headline, "White House Press Secretary Fined for Tardiness. Then, Shakes Up Small-Town Courtroom." The article embedded a few quotes from witnesses, described Karoline's calm yet powerful address, and included a grainy courtroom sketch by a local artist. The story was quickly shared by national media outlets, drawing attention not only to Karoline's legal acumen but to the broader issue of judicial bias in small-town courts. Back at her room in the Iron Lantern Inn, Karoline sat at the edge of the bed, her phone buzzing with messages, from David Klein, from reporters, from campaign allies. But what made her pause was a single text from Emily Carter, a veteran journalist in New Hampshire. "He heard what happened in Silvergate. Your silence after the fine was the loudest thing I've read in years. Proud doesn't even cover it." And yet, Karoline knew this was just the beginning, because viral moments come and go, but systems only change when someone stays to finish the fight. Within 48 hours, what began as a quiet courtroom confrontation in Silvergate had grown into a statewide reckoning. Karoline's measured takedown of Judge Beckett was no longer just a trending topic. It had become a flashpoint for long-simmering grievances across Colorado's legal community. Former defendants, local attorneys, and even retired clerks began coming forward, their stories echoing the same pattern: inconsistent rulings, harsher penalties for the young and professionally unestablished, dismissive treatment toward women and minority litigants. One such voice belonged to Samantha Quaid, a single mother from Pueblo who had been fined $900 last year for a parking code violation she didn't even understand. Her video testimonial, posted under the hashtag #JusticeNotJudgment, gained 1.2 million views in 2 days. "He called me uninformed before I even spoke," she said tearfully. "But when the contractor before me came late and blamed GPS, the judge just laughed it off." The tipping point came when Karoline's office formally submitted a memo not to the press but to the Colorado Judicial Review Commission. In it, she outlined the events of the Silvergate hearing, backed by timestamps, legal precedent, and personal observation. It wasn't a complaint, it was a report. And its tone was broken. The memo carried weight not just because of who she was, but because of how it was written: precise, respectful, and impossible to ignore. The commission responded swiftly. Cassandra Doyle, a respected civil rights investigator with a reputation for impartiality, was assigned to the case. She launched a full-scale review of Silvergate County's courtroom practices, starting with Judge Beckett's contempt rulings from the past 5 years. Accompanied by a small team of data analysts and legal interns, Doyle began combing through hundreds of court transcripts and fine records. What emerged was more than troubling, it was systemic. Younger defendants were fined nearly 3 times more than older ones for the same infractions. In cases involving women under 30, sentencing language was notably more patronizing or combative. Cases with high-profit titles, community organizers, political staffers, journalists, faced disproportionate scrutiny, as if Beckett viewed credibility as something to be earned through age or silence. Inside the courthouse, the shift was tangible. Teresa Molina, emboldened by Karoline's stand, shared her notebook with Doyle's team. Its pages were lined with quiet observations, dates, case numbers, handwritten notes like "treated coldly," "20 men late," "no fine," and "young vet," interrupted repeatedly, visibly upset. For the first time in her career, Teresa's silence transformed into substance. Meanwhile, Deputy Lucas Cheng submitted an official affidavit detailing his own experiences. "Over the years, I noticed a clear pattern. Defendants who looked confident or challenged authority, especially if they were young women, were handled differently." Beyond Silvergate, other towns took notice. Legal clinics in Boulder, Durango, and Fort Collins reported an increase in clients coming forward to share eerily similar experiences with judges in their own jurisdictions. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Beckett. It was about bias in the judiciary at large. law professors began citing the Silvergate incident in lectures. Editorials appeared in state newspapers demanding reform, and in Denver, a group of first-year law students formed the coalition Courts of Conscience, dedicated to tracking courtroom disparities in real time. Back at the White House, Karoline watched it all unfold with a steady resolve. She didn't gloat, didn't take interviews, didn't center herself in the narrative. Instead, she worked behind the scenes, answering questions from investigators, supplying documentation, and offering strategic insight on reform models. "This isn't about one judge," she told Cassandra Doyle in a private call. "It's about reestablishing the courtroom as a place where power doesn't silence truth." And as the investigation deepened, it became clear. Karoline hadn't just stood up for herself that morning in Silvergate, she had opened a door, one that had remained shut for far too long, and invited an entire state to walk through it. 3 weeks after the courtroom confrontation that ignited a movement, Karoline Leavitt sat in her Washington, D.C. office with the $600 fine receipt pinned to her bulletin board, now framed, not as a mark of shame, but as a symbol of resistance. The fallout in Colorado had reached critical mass. Investigations were still underway, but the conversation had shifted. No longer just a local controversy, Silvergate had become the epicenter of a statewide call for judicial accountability. That morning, after reviewing the latest data from Cassandra Doyle's team, Karoline finalized a formal 3-point reformation proposal, a policy draft that could reshape not just Silvergate's court but serve as a model for small-town justice reform across the country. The first point in her proposal called for transparent auditing of all contempt fines and penalties, requiring courts to log detailed justifications, timestamps, and demographic breakdowns of every instance. These records, she insisted, should be reviewed quarterly by an independent oversight committee composed of legal experts, retired judges, and members of the public. No more anonymous punishments buried in forgotten transcripts. The second point demanded mandatory bias awareness training for all courtroom personnel, not just judges, but clerks, bailiffs, and even public defenders. Drawing from behavioral psychology and real-world case studies, the training would expose unconscious prejudices and help court officers recognize patterns they had perhaps never noticed in themselves. This would be accompanied by role-based simulations, where courtroom conduct would be evaluated and reviewed by neutral observers. The third, and perhaps most forward-thinking, recommendation was the creation of a youth civic advisory board in each courthouse jurisdiction. This board would include law students, young professionals, and community members under the age of 30 who would observe court proceedings, submit anonymous feedback, and provide a generational perspective on the legal process. "Too often, young people are seen but not heard in legal spaces," Karoline wrote in her proposal. "This is how we fix that." Karoline sent the proposal first to the Colorado Judicial Review Commission, then to the governor's office, and finally to the media outlets that had been tracking the Silvergate story. The response was immediate. Civil rights organizations lauded the initiative. Law schools offered to help implement the advisory board framework. Even moderate lawmakers praised the plan's practical tone and refusal to villainize individual judges, focusing instead on rebuilding systemic trust. Later that afternoon, during a Zoom call with Cassandra Doyle and the Commission's leadership team, Karoline outlined how each reform could be tested through a 6-month pilot program in Silvergate, monitored publicly for transparency. Doyle nodded, visibly impressed. "You're not just pointing out what's broken, you're engineering the fix." For Karoline, the proposal was more than policy. It was personal restitution turned into public progress. She hadn't gone to that courtroom in search of a fight, but once the fight found her, she made sure it didn't end with a moment. It would end with a movement. 3 months later, the Colorado morning sun bathed the brick walls of the Silvergate County Courthouse in golden light. Workers affixed a fresh metal sign beside the courthouse doors, "Center for Judicial Training and Fairness." Beneath it, a plaque bore the date of Karoline Leavitt's hearing, a quiet acknowledgement of the day a courtroom changed direction. Inside the main hall, the crowd gathered, not for a trial, but for a ceremony. Judges, clerks, students, reporters, and community members filled the gallery seats, chatting softly, glancing around at the unfamiliar sight of openness and optimism within these old walls. On the far right, Teresa Molina, now promoted to Director of Court Transparency, adjusted the lapel pin on her blazer, her first day wearing it. Deputy Lucas Chang, no longer silent in the shadows, stood beside a table stacked with new training manuals, ready to begin leading the courthouse's first mandatory bias awareness workshop. And in the back of the room, quietly observing as always, stood Karoline Leavitt. She wore the same navy blazer from that day, her blonde hair pinned back in its usual tidy sweep, though something in her posture had softened. Still confident, but lighter, as though the weight she once carried had finally been redistributed. Judge Ronald Beckett was there too, not in his black robe but in a gray suit, seated humbly in the third row. After the investigation concluded and the data confirmed what so many had silently known, he had been given a choice: face a public hearing or step down voluntarily. He resigned. But instead of disappearing, Beckett asked to be part of the solution. Now, in front of his former peers, he stood at the podium, no gavel, no bench, just a man who had once misused authority, now acknowledging it. "I thought treating everyone the same was fairness," he admitted, voice softer than anyone had heard before. "But I never stopped to ask why some people always seemed to fall through the cracks." As he returned to his seat, Karoline rose and made her way to the front, not as a press secretary, but as a citizen, a reformer. She spoke not of politics nor of power, but of possibility. "Every courtroom has two doors," she said, "one for justice and one for judgment. And too often, the one that opens depends on your age, your gender, your background, or who they think you are when you walk in." Later, in the lobby, Karoline stood before the new plaque, its inscription etched into bronze. "Justice isn't just about the law, it's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below it, her fine receipt hung in a simple frame, "Not erased. Remembered." As the crowd filtered out into the square, Julian Romero, now a full-time clerk and recent law school graduate, walked beside Karoline. "You know," she said, "that day changed my entire path. I'm applying to the Civil Rights Division next year. I want to make sure what happened here happens everywhere." Back in D.C. days later, as she resumed her work handling the pressures of national media and executive messaging, Karoline kept that framed fine on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder: one voice, one courtroom, one choice to say, "This isn't right." Because justice doesn't always begin with a ruling. Sometimes it begins with a refusal to stay silent. The story of Karoline Leavitt's unexpected courtroom stand in Silvergate teaches a profound lesson. Real change often begins in the most unassuming moments, and true leadership isn't about position, it's about courage. When Karoline was unfairly fined and humiliated by a judge who mistook authority for justice, she could have stayed silent, paid the fine, and walked away. Instead, she chose to speak up, not with outrage, but with calm, reasoned clarity. Her refusal to accept bias, not just for herself but for everyone in that courtroom, sparked a chain reaction far beyond one zoning hearing. This story reminds us that systemic problems often hide behind routine, and that challenging them doesn't always require a megaphone, just the right words spoken at the right time. It shows how professionalism, preparation, and integrity can dismantle outdated power structures, not through rebellion, but through responsibility. Most importantly, it reveals that even in environments built to suppress dissent, one person armed with truth and composure can realign the scales of justice. Karoline didn't just defend herself, she elevated the standard for everyone. And in doing so, she proved that no matter your age, background, or title, you have the power to stand up and to make it count.